Chapter 34, Act 34, The Dark Knight's Tale. Act 34, The Dark Knight's Tale, The Eternal. Rydia didn't realize someone was standing behind her until she felt the bleak chill of shadow drape over her shoulders. Even so, she didn't raise her head, her gaze was solely focused on the scuffed clay tile of the roofing beneath her curled-up legs. She was exhausted from their hurried and increasingly panicked search of the Feymarch, which had yielded a big, fat nothing in regard to clues about how they had ended up there, how they could escape, and what they were supposed to do next. Unlike her Feymarch, the village she had grown up in, this one seemed to stretch on forever, like someone had multiplied the Feymarch of the blue planet 100-fold and dropped all the copies into a haphazard map with no rhyme or reason. It made exploring mind-numbing, and with no way to trace their steps, it was hard to tell what progress they were making, if any. That was when Rydia had finally called for a break and climbed onto the rooftop of a nearby house so she could get a sense of direction. There had been the strange door that Ursula had found. Thanks to her, they had at least learned that Theodore and some of their other friends were alive, although it also meant they were no longer ensconced in the safety of the lunar whale. The guilt that overtook Rydia when she realized they had probably come looking for her was agonizing, and nearly made her burst into tears right then and there. To add insult to injury, when Rydia had raced back with Ursula to see if they could make contact once more, the glass in the portal had completely blackened, and no one responded to Ursula's call. Either Theodore and the others had already moved on, or... Well, she didn't want to think about the alternative. That portal simply has to be the key to getting out of here, Rydia sighed. But how are we to activate it again? And then there was the matter of that glowing red light at the northern border of the village. It had gone unsaid by all that it had become their de facto objective point, but what exactly was waiting for them there? Friend, foe, or something much more terrifying?
Rydia.
Finally, Rydia looked over her shoulder, blinking her vision back into focus. Her eyes had crossed from staring too long at meaningless scratches in clay.
Oh. Luca.
Luca plopped down next to Rydia, giving a tendril of her hair a friendly tug.
You all right, space case?
Hey. Rydia shook her head.
Do I not seem all right?
Luca smiled slightly.
You must have a lot weighing on your mind. Cecil, of course. But also, the fates of the Eidolon King and Queen, at least, that's all this place would make me think about, if I had the same history with it as you.
Well, Luca certainly had her pegged.
Yes.
Rydia pulled her knees to her chest.
Perhaps it was obvious from the start, considering there was no way we could have been dropped back on the blue planet so easily, but this isn't the real Feymarch. It's just a twisted parody, a husk that lacks the true soul of the village and the magic that was its lifeblood. I can feel none of Azura or Leviathan's divine energy.
She bit down on her lip.
Actually, I haven't been able to feel a thing since I woke up. It's the same kind of numb as when you found me wandering outside of the Feymarch after Azura banished me. Even if this isn't the real Feymarch, just being here makes me feel as if I'm betraying her all over again.
Luca shook her head.
You can't give up on their highnesses yet, Rydia, not when you've come so far. I know they must be waiting for you right now. Just as all the other Eidolons did. You don't need a trinket to bring them back from the clutches of that witch, it's what's in your heart that will save them. I have faith in you, and so does Cecil. What would he tell you if he were sitting here right now? He'd probably be embarrassed and awkward and just sit there in silence until I said something.
Rydia smiled weakly.
He wouldn't realize that he doesn't have to say a thing. Just being by his side eases my heart in a way that I'll never grow out of. He'll always be my knight, and I think in his eyes, I'm always going to be a little girl from Mist. And I would be so happy if it could just stay that way forever.
She closed her eyes, hugging her knees closer.
That's why I have to do whatever I can to help break that girl's curse. She's held the hearts of my dearest loves hostage for far too long. You're a good friend, Rydia,
Luca beamed.
Both Cecil and I are lucky to have you.
Rydia couldn't help but blush, and gave Luca a shy, grateful grin.
Thank you, Luca. But enough about me for now. You seem like you've been enjoying yourself up here on the moon, especially when you were helping Golbez pilot the lunar whale.
Luca tilted her head, blushing along with Rydia.
Is it that obvious? Well, I didn't want to bring it up, since it seems a little inappropriate, given everything that has happened. But there's someone very special to me here, and he just makes my heart feel a million times lighter, no matter how awful things get. I guess he's kind of like my Cecil. Wah.
Rydia blinked, her smile faltering.
You mean? Palom. No.
Luca jumped up, clasping her hands over her mouth and shaking her head hurriedly.
Oh, no, 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 no. I'm talking about Master Sid. There's still so much I still want to learn from that man. It's thanks to him that I'm living a life I could have never dreamed of accomplishing by myself. Can you imagine what things would be like for me if Sid didn't help convince my father to let me take up engineering? Probably boring as hell.
Rydia let out a discreet sigh, careful not to let her relief show so obviously on her face.
Have you talked with Palom at all?
Since he totally blew you off in Troya? Luca shrugged, crossing her arms.
It doesn't matter anymore.
Rydia was tempted to ask Luca to repeat herself, she wasn't sure if she had heard correctly.
Hey. Oh, I don't mean anything more than that. Honestly. I mean, certainly, I had my fair share of jealousy and everything. But now, it just doesn't matter that much to me anymore. Luca.
Rydia suddenly felt bad for all the times she openly loathed Luca's crush, or whatever you wanted to call her relationship with Palom. Regardless of how she had felt about the whole thing, she realized that Luca probably felt a million times worse as she had watched whatever they had had fall apart before her eyes, and she had been doing so with a cheerful smile on her face, all while letting Rydia cry on her shoulder about Cecil, the Eidolons, and all the rest. Luca waved her hand dismissively.
Don't look at me like I'm about to jump off this roof and end it all. It's not like I hate him or anything. I've just got other things I need to worry about right now. Really? Really? And you know who taught me that? You. Ever since our little heart-to-heart in the Agard mine, I've been doing some serious thinking about some changes that I want to make after all this is over. I've figured out really quick that we're never guaranteed another day, and I've still got a lot more dreams I've got to make come true for myself before I can settle down and be someone's dream girl. We dwarves don't like dwelling over the small things in life, you know, and Palom is pretty puny. I told that boy he needs to put on some weight, but he just doesn't listen. Hee hee.
Rydia couldn't help but giggle.
That's certainly a very dwarven thing to say.
Luca nodded, puffing out her chest.
Well, how about you grow a little dwarven spirit yourself, then? We've still got Cecil to save. Along with Azura and all the rest. You're right.
Rydia scrambled to her feet, mimicking Luca's pose and grinning.
This isn't over yet, not by a long shot. And this time, there's so many more of us fighting for our planet, there is no way we're not going to succeed. You two look like a couple of dashing heroes up there.
Luca and Rydia stared at each other. If they were being perfectly honest, they both looked more like survivors of a dumpster fire at this point in their journey together, and burst into laughter, peering over the ledge of the roof. Yang was standing below, gazing up at them. He raised his hand in a wave, motioning behind him with his head.
Ursula and Sid have started up again. Are you rested? I feel great,
Rydia smiled, and Luca nodded.
Better than ever, Master Yang. Then we'd best hurry so we can catch up.
Yang smiled.
Ursula is eager to find more clues about that door she found. More like she's eager to see Theodore again.
Luca smirked, and Rydia watched with amusement as the teasing remark slowly sank through Yang's thick skull, his mustache drooping with the speed of the lunar whale shooting into space. His eyes darting away awkwardly, he muttered something along the lines of
that practically being incest.
And began to walk away, his back tensely hunched. Rydia tried to stifle her laughter behind her hand, shaking her head.
Luca? What is it with you and stirring the pot when it comes to drama? Poor Theodore is going to get the dirtiest look the next time he sees Yang, and he'll have no idea why. I saw the look on Ursula's face when she told us Theodore was okay.
Luca shrugged, as if that excused everything.
Besides, I am still a princess, you know, I was born to be dramatic. All I get to do is talk shop with Master Sid when I'm on the overworld, he never gives me good gossip, and I know he's got a ton of it. The old man always holds out on me.
Oh, you have no idea, Rydia thought to herself, shaking her head. If Sid shared even a fraction of the angst-ridden teenage tension he had probably witnessed between Cecil, Rosa, and Kane as they were growing up, Luca would never want to leave the shipyard again. But I do understand exactly what you are going through, Luca. I wish I could say that I knew I made the right choices at the crossroads of my life, looking back on everything. But to be honest, I'm still not sure. And I don't know if I ever will be. Am I ever going to be able to live a life without regret? Edge, You idiot! Why are you never around when I actually need you?
Ah.
The Queen of Eblan reared back, clutching her skull as a pair of pale pink and green ivory horns tore through her temples and began to grow outward like a pair of twitching antennae, stretching toward the ceiling. Next to her, Edge's father was hunched over, clutching his sides and laughing manically as a black, leathery wing with sharpened tips extending from the fingers exploded from his shoulder blade. The close-trimmed beard along his chin and neck blossomed into a riot of blue-black fur that quickly wove itself over his face like a lion's mane. Tsukinawa screamed at the transformations unfurling before his eyes, shaking Izaoi's shoulders and begging her to wake up as he concocted a heel pill ninjutsu spell. Gekao hesitated as he reached for his axe, and Edge whirled around to face him, tears blurring his sight and turning Gekao into a blob of black and red.
You can't. Please. They're my. I would never forget the faces of my late lords, no matter what form they may take,
Gekao frowned.
But master.
He was interrupted as the former king roared and dove forward on all fours, a club-tipped tail shooting outward and wrapping around Edge's neck as he was slammed to the ground and pinned beneath the king's weight. The queen hissed hungrily, her heart-shaped lips stained green with venom that had begun to drip from freshly cut fangs as she hovered over her husband's widening shoulders.
Ugh.
Edge swung his head wildly as a drop of the venom splashed on his forehead, his skin instantly erupting into a mess of pus-ridden blisters. He bit his lip to contain his scream, clawing at the tightening tail around his neck as his mother leaned in closer, the bottom half of her jaw unhinging ghoulishly. A wiry forked tongue spilled out in a coil, sliding itself along the hollow of Edge's cheek. Forgive me, Edge. Gekao grimaced, raising his axe and aiming it for the dead center of the king's spinal column. I can't lose you to such a nightmare, may the gods forgive me for turning my weapon on their majesties.
Out of the way.
Gekao whirled around, startled, as something shiny soared past his head and shattered on the floor surrounding Edge and his parents. A waft of pearlescent smoke billowed around the trio, briefly obscuring them from Gekao's view. Izaoi had risen to her feet, spitting out a cork from between her teeth as she ran to Gekao's side. Tsukinawa was now attempting to rouse Zangetsu, his eyes still wide with panic.
What was that?
Gekao gasped, waving some of the smoke away from his face.
It's... ugh. Rather potent. Smelling salts,
Izaoi shrugged off her bow, sliding an arrow in place and pulling the string taut in one fluid motion.
An enhanced recipe I've been working to perfect, it uses the cleansing properties of the sea to both stir the body and purify the mind. I don't understand. Well, if it doesn't do what I'm hoping, then that's what this is for.
She nodded toward the readied arrow, her eyes narrowing as the smoke began to dissipate.
Steady now.
Gekao looked away, muttering a prayer under his breath as he raised his axe once again. Edge was collapsed on the floor, his eyes squeezed shut and his jaw clenched, his nerves alit with anticipation of the death blow that would finally end it all. Both the king and queen had frozen in place over him, their transformations halted in a disturbing half-human, half-monstrous state. But the slightest gleam of life could be seen spilling from their gazes, which had taken on the shimmer of familiar, crystalline light.
Edge!
The king moaned, and Gekao, Izaoi, and the now stirring Zangetsu nearly fell over, shocked that the voice of their long-lost lord sounded exactly as they had remembered it, even coming from this horror of a chimera. Tsukinawa struggled under the weight of Zanjutsu's form, using his shoulders as a crutch, his heart pounding wildly. It was odd, considering he hadn't even been a thought when Master Edge's parents had been in power, but he felt as if he had known them too. Once upon a time, hearing Edge's name fall from the lips of this creature sparked a queer sentimentality inside of him, the kind he had always thought he should feel for his own dead father, but never actually had.
Dad!
Edge's eyes fluttered open, another tear falling down his cheek as he forced himself to sit up, wincing from the stinging wound on his forehead. He recognizes me.
You've grown into such a fine man.
The queen fell to one knee, delicately running her claw-like nails through Edge's hair as to not hurt him.
Mom!
Edge sobbed, pressing his head against her hand and closing his eyes.
Why? Why must your souls be desecrated once again? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
The king shook his shaggy head.
Do not wail for us, Edge. We are happy. Yes.
The queen bit down on her lip as she brushed her thumb over Edge's wound, a bead of green trailing from the corner of her mouth.
Happy that we could see you once more. The crystal has granted us a most wonderful gift.
Edge peered up at her, dragging his fist over his running nose.
The crystal. We haven't much more time,
the king sighed.
We are but mindless apparitions, yet our souls were drawn back to you from the depths. Please. Save Evelyn. Save our world.
The queen whimpered, looking up from Edge and peering at the Evelyn Four, who were all staring at her, stunned.
And protect Evelyn's one and only precious heir. It shall be done, my king. And my queen.
Gekao swept into a bow, lowering his axe across his abdomen. Izayoi, Zangetsu, and Tsukinawa followed suit, closing their eyes.
Mom.
Edge shook his head.
Please, wait. The crystals. How are they doing this? No matter what this moon shows you, you must continue to believe in the crystal's light.
The king's voice drifted into the hum of the tower as his body faded away.
And the light in the hearts of your friends.
The queen smiled, fading alongside him. Edge raced to his feet clumsily, reaching up to grasp the empty air where they had just been standing as their voices echoed in unison from within the chamber walls.
When all seems lost, you need only to choose happiness.
Edge reluctantly lowered his hand, squinting his eyes as the crystal shards vibrated and released a spill of brilliant light that swept through the room. When it all faded away, they were left with a single portal of starlight, the decimated crystals nowhere to be seen and the dazes empty once more. You have nothing to worry about. My master is truly your heir in every regard. Zangetsu thought, lifting from his bow. Izayoi wordlessly turned and pulled Tsukinawa into her arms, pressing her lips to his hair as she gazed at Edge over the boy's forehead. Your Majesties. Please, may you rest in peace. I will protect my master, and my family, even if it costs me my life. Tsukinawa let himself sink into Izayoi's embrace, wrapping his arms around her waist and closing his eyes. My lord and lady. It was an honor to have been in your presence. Edge shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips as he took in the shimmering portal, and looked to Gekao, who was watching him expectantly, but patiently, next to it. I still don't get what exactly is happening, but I accept what may become my final mission. To be entrusted with the land that you loved so much when you were alive, and loved more so even in death, enough still to tear yourselves away from your heavenly slumber when it falls to crisis once more. Perhaps this is the honor Gekao has been going on about that I need to protect. I thank you, Mom and Dad. I know that no matter how many nightmares I awaken from, you'll always be at my side.
Father.
Theodore fell back, clasping his hands to his mouth as Cecil grasped at Golbez's cloak and turned his lightless eyes directly onto Theodore, empty pools of blue boring into the boy's skull as another scream reverberated off the cavern walls. Baigan and Kane were exchanging a frenzied series of blows, Rosa desperately trying to keep up with Kane to enchant him with protective magic as he launched himself off of walls and into the air to strike Baigan from above. The former Baronian captain was still quite adept with his sword, even with an amputated limb and body mutated in near totality, so it was easy for him to dodge most of Kane's advances. Cecil's flailing had caught Golbez off guard, and he misfired a stop spell, the cherry-red paralyzing beam sailing over Baigan's shoulder and smashing into the mirror, shattering the glass over the battlefield. Theodore swallowed the lump in his throat and attempted to grab at his father's hands to hold them in place, only to be rewarded with another ear-piercing shriek that made Theodore's blood turn to ice. He must be in horrible pain. Why? Then, quite suddenly, Baigan dropped his sword, his eyes rolling in the back of his head as he sank to his knees and attempted to cover his ears with both his stump and his remaining hand, his own guttural wail competing with Cecil's and filling the chamber with an excruciating symphony. Taking advantage of the opening, Kane plunged his lance into Baigan's chest, planting his foot on his shoulder and using the monster's body for leverage as he yanked backwards. A stream of purple ooze erupted from the wound, and Baigan fell onto his back, eyes wide and mouth outstretched in a silent scream.
Oh my gods,
Theodore muttered at the sight of Baigan's seizing body, not noticing that Cecil's hands had gone limp in his own. Kane sheathed his weapon, and Rosa approached Baigan's right side, her crossbow aimed directly at his forehead as she leaned over him.
Please. While I still have life.
Baigan hacked, his tongue hanging out the side of his mouth.
Beware. It's still live. What still lives?
Golbez demanded. But it was all over. No sooner did Baigan's head hit the ground did his body disappear in a haze of ebony, crystal and fog, the crystal and mirror shards crushed beneath his form dissolving into flecks of light. Behind him, the broken glass of the mirror transformed into a rippling blanket of stars, and when Cain hesitatingly brushed his fingers over the portal, a delicate surge of radiance raised up his arm.
He said he was reborn from the crystal.
Cain raised his hand to his face, wiggling his fingers. They hadn't been hurt from the light, but now they felt tingly, and an almost anxious sensation had overtaken his body. Like his mind had been jolted into overdrive, and he was on the cusp of remembering something critical.
So that's why there was shattered crystal everywhere,
Rosa sighed, lowering her bow.
Theodore, what did you see when you came out here?
Theodore explained the state of the crystal and the mirror when he had arrived, revealing that he had been able to make contact with Ursula before Baigan had attacked.
The crystal must have shattered shortly after we teleported into this place.
Golbez frowned.
Baigan sensed Cecil's presence, escaped from the crystal, and decided to lie in wait. But what he didn't realize is that while the real Cecil was here, he was attacking the wrong man.
He was hiding in the mirror this whole time, waiting to kill my father? Theodore shuddered involuntarily. When he saw my eye peering into the crystal, that's when he must have mistaken me for Cecil. As soon as Ursula left, he made his move.
And Cecil reacted to him, too.
Cain shook his head.
Somehow he knew that was Baigan. And it was Cecil's scream that disabled him. It almost seemed as if Baigan had come to his senses before he passed,
Rosa murmured.
He said beware. Like he was trying to warn us about something.
She turned to Golbez and Cecil, who was limp once again in Golbez's arms.
But how could someone that father defeated 17 years ago be here now?
Theodore warily watched Cecil's sleeping face as he spoke, waiting for his haunted eyes to snap back open and consume him whole.
It's got to be some sort of illusion, the crystals can't bring back the dead. I don't know,
Cain muttered. Why would Cecil react so strongly to a mere illusion? Golbez lowered his head, silently clenching and releasing his fist beneath his cape to the rhythm of his little brother's shallow, but at last steady breathing. Perhaps I am splitting hairs. But there's a difference between bringing back the dead and being reborn. Isn't there?
Are you having any luck, Edward? Not yet. Same as a minute ago, my dear. Are you just checking up on us? Nope. Not at all.
Porum was a fairly terrible liar. For a while, she had been afraid that perhaps her miscreant brother's habit of slinging falsehoods like one took in breath was rubbing off on her, but it was almost a relief to realize that she was now only becoming good at lying in certain situations, where perhaps it was warranted. She recognized that this was not one of those times and that she was as transparent as a freshly washed pane of glass. Porum rolled his eyes, and Porum bit her lip, trying to hold back every impulse she had to not turn around and smack him in the face.
We'll contact you when we've found something.
Edward was trying to be oh so very patient with her. The gods bless the man for his delicate sensibilities.
You're still not in danger, right? No,
Porum sighed. It was quite the opposite, actually. They were cozily trapped in a perfectly benign room with no monsters, no traps, and nary a threat. After they had stepped through the portal, they had been rather anticlimactically deposited on another floor of the Tower of Babel. After trying a few doors that all seemed to be sealed shut, they had finally come across the doorway to the room they were in now, except that nothing had been inside, and now they were seemingly locked in by the same force that had kept them out of the other rooms. Meanwhile, Edward and Harley revealed via the Whisperweed that they had ended up, in their words,
in yet another tower, similar to Babel, but not quite the same.
After relentless grilling from Porum, Harley had started ignoring the Whisperweed, effectively cutting them off. It wasn't until Porum, Hallam, and Leonora had gotten themselves trapped that their counterparts had opened up the lines of communication again, promising to find a way to release them from wherever they had ended up. Porum set aside the Whisperweed, pressing her back against the glass wall and letting out a low sigh. Leonora was curled up on the floor a few feet away, using her mitre as a pillow and passed out, having used up the remainder of her energy dithering and worrying about what people would think if they found her dead body trapped in a room alone with a man. What am I, a ghost? Porum had mused in disbelief. And shouldn't you be more worried about the actual being dead part in your bizarre stress fantasies? Palom was mindlessly playing with a fire spell in his hands, the shadows that normally occupied his chestnut eyes temporarily vanished by the glow of the dancing flames. Porom wondered if she should say anything about Palom potentially sucking up precious oxygen in the closed room by feeding it to his spell, but figured such a comment would end up with one of them, well, him, getting punched, and decided to stick to a less controversial train of thought.
I really should have stayed behind,
Porom murmured, cognizant of Leonora's steadily rising and falling chest as she lowered her voice. The girl looked positively wiped, best to let her sleep for as long as possible.
I knew it all along.
Palom kept his eyes on the flame before him, barely shaking his head.
Don't worry. I'm sure the elder's fine. Other people can take care of themselves, you know, you don't have to nanny everyone.
Porom lowered her chin to her chest, letting the insult roll off her back. It would have been much worse, in her opinion, if she had been accused of the opposite, not caring enough.
That's not all I'm worried about. You know how terrible things are down there.
Palom finally put the fire out by folding his hands together, smothering it between his fingers.
That's why we're here right now. We need to save Cecil and stop this moon.
I know what we need to do, she thought miserably. I'm just not sure I can do it. I couldn't even save our crystal from being taken in the first place. I couldn't save him, either. Palom crawled over to her, shoving his face into hers even as she refused to look up at him.
You think the elder's gonna keel over and die just like that? Come on. That's not the elder I know. He survived raising me, for God's sake. He can handle anything else no problem.
Porom couldn't help but smile a little, as ridiculous as that sounded to compare the end of the world to being an adoptive father of twin magical prodigies. Palom was totally on the nose.
Yes. I suppose you're right.
Palom watched as she glanced down at what had been her injured hand, her fingers hurriedly brushing over a twisted mess of metal he spied on her pinky finger. He felt something funny flip-flop in his stomach as he caught a familiar flash of chintzy gold in the aseptic light of the room.
You're acting kind of weird, you know that.
He muttered, and she finally looked up at him, chewing on her lower lip.
Listen, Palom. You still want to become a sage, right? Hey.
He fell back on his rear in surprise.
What are you bringing that up for, all of a sudden? You respect Tella and you to follow in his footsteps. Right. Well, how am I supposed to know? Not at a time like this, no.
He scratched his head, glancing over his shoulder at Leonora to make sure she hadn't awoken. He would die of embarrassment if she heard them right now. Porom flushed.
I'm sorry. You're right.
She shifted her weight, pushing herself up onto her knees. As she did so, he watched her hand again, now unguarded, and felt as if someone had knocked the air out of his lungs. She still has my... After all this time? Palom took one last look at Leonora before dropping his voice another octave. Porom could barely hear his whisper over the hum of the energy that powered the hateful tower.
I kind of realized something when I left my Mysidia, though. Oh.
Porom blinked.
What's that? There are other people out there with the talent for that title. Not just me.
Porom could hear his heart pounding from a mile away.
You mean? Leonora.
He blushed, a small smile lifting the corners of his mouth.
Yeah. It kills me to admit it, but...
Porom drew in a sharp breath, smiling with him.
Well, that's a rare sight. Seeing you compliment someone. I'm not complimenting her, okay? She's my apprentice.
Palom crossed his arms over his chest, his usual sneer wiping the smile clean from his face. Porom giggled behind her hand, shaking her head.
What? Oh, I'm just glad you're still the same old Palom. It feels like so much has changed as of late, after all. Maybe not as much as you would think,
Palom huffed, nodding toward the scorched and melted rings on her hand.
Care to explain what you're doing wearing my ring? You know, that old twin meteor magic trick doesn't work without two bearers, right? Or is your memory finally slipping at the ripe old age of 22?
Now it was Porom's turn to blush. She gingerly twisted one of the two rings off her finger, holding it up between them and peering through the warped band into Palem's eyes.
While you were gone, I got a little scared. The elder had asked me to return to Mount Ordeals to find Cain, and all I could think about how the last time I had been there, expecting to never return, I had had at least you by my side. I thought maybe if I took what I had left of you with me, the mountain would accept my soul once again and let me return to my city whole. I guess you could say I succumbed to superstition.
Superstition, sure, Palom drawled, plucking the ring away and jamming it on his pinky, the only finger of his on which it would fit, same as her. He held it up, doing a pretentious wrist flick of a wave.
Or you missed me.
Porum clasped her hand over her mouth, her eyes watering as she took in their matching fingers. Never again in her lifetime had she thought the two of them would have a reconciliation like this, and it had only taken the end of the world to bring it about.
I might have missed you a little. Probably not as much as you missed me.
Palom reddened at the sight of his sister crying, and turned away, praying that now would not be the time Leonora chose to rise from her catnap as he blinked away a few tears of his own.
Ah, forget it. Let's just go help that guy and get this thing over with already.
Porum tilted her head, laughing through a sob.
You mean Cecil? Yes. Cecil. Whatever.
Theodore was the last to step through the portal's light, his heart having leapt into his throat from the journey as he dropped onto a cold flagstone path, a totally different sensation from what he had just been getting used to treading the dust-ridden, nearly silent lunar subterrane. The journey through the portal had felt remarkably similar to the Devil's Road, with the exception of him not being forced to concentrate on his desired destination this time. Even so, he was mentally drained as if he had been doing just that, and he felt his knees buckle threateningly beneath him as he took his first timid steps forward. He spun around, watching as the portal collapsed in on itself and disappear in a final flash of light. Well, no turning back now. Cain raised an eyebrow as he took a long look in the room they had been dropped off in, although it was rather more like a corridor. Ivory bricks surrounded them with a couple lit torches, the only doorway in sight several paces away. Twin stone statues flanked each side of the door, each one the size of a small child with hands extended toward the walls. Despite the wear in the stone, they were so lifelike that Theodore could have sworn for a moment that two kids really were in the room with them, demonstrating an impossible feat of strength.
Where are we?
Theodore frowned, and Cain stared at him in disbelief.
You don't recognize your own home. What? It's the antechamber in Baron Castle,
Rosa said softly.
Is this a joke?
Theodore crossed his arms.
The same antechamber we just fought a massive battle in not so long ago? This is a quarter of the size, and we've never had statues like these in the castle for the entirety of my life.
He turned to face Golbez, so confused that he forgot to be nervous.
You were just in the castle too, this doesn't look right to you, does it?
Golbez knitted his brows together, looking past Theodore toward the closed throne room before them.
Well, that's because this castle is from before you were born.
He pushed forward, ignoring Theodore's dumbstruck stare as he unceremoniously dropped Cecil into Cain's arms and reached for the door handles. Cain, not expecting the exchange, staggered a bit under Cecil's weight as he gathered himself and called after Golbez.
Wait. What are you doing? I know what's coming next, stay here if you want to live.
Stop. Rosa gasped, but he had already disappeared, pulling the doors shut behind him with a solid bang. She turned to Cain, shaking her head.
What's waiting for us this time? If only I could remember.
Cain frowned, staring down at Cecil.
What would be waiting for us that only Golbez would know about? Oh no,
Rosa gulped, cutting him off as she vaguely recalled the story Cecil had told her about his return to Baron after she had been kidnapped by Golbez. She yanked the doors open.
There's no time. Let's go.
Golbez was standing in the center of Cecil's throne room, although Theodore supposed if it really was from before he was born, that it meant it wasn't Cecil's chamber at all, it would have belonged to the king who reigned before him, the man who had transformed himself into Odin when he had been murdered by Golbez. But the room itself didn't appear to be so different from what he was used to, it just felt emptier without the usual cavalcade of guards hanging around, had a lot less flowers and cheery touches that made it actually look lived in, and a throne was missing that would have been for his mother. The previous king had never married, nor had he ever borne an heir. Even so, the most obvious difference was the heavy hanging ebony crystal floating above the sole throne, a flurry of hairline cracks racing up its face. Even without having properly witnessed Bygon's rebirth, Theodore and the others knew what was to come next.
Where are you?
Theodore growled, withdrawing Excalibur.
Show us your face.
Golbez clenched his fists, not bothering to look at any of them.
I told you, stay away.
But before anyone could argue, one of the cracks in the crystal gave way to a deep gouge, the formidable roar of raging water filling the atmosphere as a spray of briny sea burst out of the gouge and began to pour all over the throne and cascade down the stairs where Golbez was waiting, swishing over his bare feet. The crystal gave way to more cracks, each one spouting a new stream of water that went shooting out in different directions, filling the throne room with a shallow pool that was steadily rising by the minute. There came the sound of grinding glass, and the crystal finally shattered from the pressure of the escaping water, bursting into countless fragments as an inky shadow deposited from the crystal into the throne, glistening navy flesh the consistency of patent leather drawn tightly over an oblong, grinning skull. Behind the creature's head, a massive azure and sapphire-encrusted shell formed, 4 bowed legs protruding forth, 2 on each side. The throne collapsed in on itself beneath the weight of the beast, and he scuttled forward down the stairs, teeth gnashing as he made a beeline for Golbez. A painful flash of memory from when he had been bewitched by Golbez jolted Cain as a swirl of water climbed up his calves.
This is an elemental archfiend,
he cried, leaping backward without a moment to spare as the creature's lumbering mass sent a human-sized wave of water barreling toward him and Cecil.
The drowned king, Cagnazo,
Golbez replied, his tone laced with a twinge of sadness as he blasted a Blizzaga spell directly in the monster's face. The force of the ice explosion sent Cagnazo rolling backward in his shell, sending it spinning across the floor as another surge of water rushed the room. Rosa cast slow on Cagnazo in an attempt to stymie the storm waters, but they just continued to pour down upon the party from the ceilings and walls without pause. Theodore desperately waded to the throne room doors, fearful of the rapidly rising pool-turned ocean surrounding them that had no place to drain. But when he tried pulling on the latch,
the doors are locked,
Theodore shrieked.
The room is going to fill up with water. We can shoot out the windows,
Rosa exclaimed, raising her bow and arrow toward the beautiful picture windows behind the crushed throne. Just as she was about to release the first arrow, a powerful cyclone of water crashed upon her, the undertow that was gravitating toward Cagnazo's spinning shell dragging her under the swell.
Mother!
Theodore cried, abandoning Excalibur and inhaling deeply before diving under the surf to swim to her. Cain cursed under his breath, being forced to leap to yet another corner of the room and realizing very quickly that there was not any safe place he could possibly stash Cecil, he reluctantly admitted to himself that he should have listened to Golbez and stayed outside. The waters that were being drawn toward Cagnazo had begun to form a towering wall around the fiend, the water mixing with Golbez's Blizzaga spell and creating an impenetrable shield that no weapon could pierce. Theodore surfaced with Rosa moments before she was drawn beneath the rising barrier, hacking mouthfuls of water as he tried to claw his way back to the others against the direction of the tide, her unresponsive head slumped against his shoulder.
Just a little more,
Golbez muttered, mid-incantation. His eyes were trained on Theodore and Rosa, counting down to the last possible second he would have to intervene and abandon his spell. He mentally urged Theodore to find the strength to swim faster. If he had to start over with his magic, it might be too late. In moments, Cagnazo would release the gathering waters and turn upon them a gargantuan tidal wave, along with a guaranteed drowning. Cain spotted Theodore and Rosa emerging from the water out of the corner of his eye, clutching Cecil against his shoulder as he dashed across the water and let out a forced laugh.
Your debts continue to pile up, old friend.
Extending his free hand, he summoned the Holy Lance to his side, extending it as far as he could manage as he locked his shaking legs to keep himself from being pulled away too. Theodore whimpered as he made one last-ditch effort to surge forward, his fingers just barely grasping the soaked ribbons dangling from the lance's vamp blade before Cain yanked back, reeling the two of them in like the catch of the day. At that moment, Golbez released his spell, a powerful Thundaga bolt that ripped from the heavens far beyond the castle, penetrating the ceiling above Cagnazo and sending both a chandelier and a massive pile of rubble crashing into him. The force of the electrical storm decimated the water wall, releasing a cloud of steam into the air between the fiend and the party. Cagnazo growled menacingly as his fried, smoking maw emerged from the depths of his shell. He fixed his milky, pupil-less eyes on Golbez through the haze as a slow grin formed, a collision of golden teeth exposed thanks to his severe underbite.
Is this death? Yes. My sleep was disturbed. Ha. Ha. Now I can sleep again.
Golbez lowered his hands, offering Cagnazo a slight smile of his own.
Sleep in peace. For I, too, may join you in your hell someday.
At the sound of Golbez's voice, Cagnazo's eyes came to life, the creature eagerly dragging himself forward a few pathetic paces before collapsing in a fried heap.
I knew I had felt such power once before. Master Golbez, It is an honor to meet you again. Words cannot express.
But before he could finish his sentiments, death relinquished the hold on his agony, shading the whites of his eyes an opaque grey before the rest of his body began to dissolve into the same familiar crystalline fog as bygone. The remaining water in the room gathered around the fiend's fallen form, swirling into a dizzying whirlpool before draining away and revealing a brand new portal embedded in the throne room floor. Master Golbez. Theodore turned his gaze away awkwardly as he busied himself by reviving his mother with a race spell. Golbez used to control creatures like that? I knew he was powerful, but...
What is going on here?
With a flick of his hand, Kane's lance disappeared, and he kneeled behind Theodore and Rosa, gently resting Cecil next to them on the floor. He was sleeping so peacefully that Kane could almost swear he saw a smile on his friend's lips. It was the complete opposite of his freak-out with bygone.
Why are the crystals bringing forth our past enemies? I know not,
Golbez sighed.
But the other archfiends are not far behind, I'm sure. If the others encounter them, they'll be okay.
Rosa coughed, her eyes fluttering open as a deluge of filthy water sputtered out of her throat.
We've beaten them before. We can do it again.
She slowly pushed herself into an upright position, covering her mouth as she coughed again and took in Cecil's sleeping form. Oh, Cecil. Are you seeing any of this? Golbez eyed the portal that had opened underneath Cagnazzo's corpse, silently kneeling to take Cecil back into his arms. That creature had Cagnazzo's sway over water. Was susceptible to his weaknesses. In the end, he even spoke with Cagnazzo's voice. But for him to take so long to recognize me. Our enemy has their claws in something far more sinister than merely reviving the dead. Edward tucked away the whisperweed in his vest pocket, the smile he had forced to keep his tone light and airy with Porum falling away as soon as their connection was cut off. He loved the girl dearly despite her being a chronic worrier and planner. She reminded him much of Harley when she had been her age. The young woman who had landed on his doorstep 17 years ago had been ready to take over the world, and he saw much of the same spirit in the white mage. But it hadn't just been Porum's, overly attentive concerns about his and Harley's safety that were eating away at him. His mind had been racing non-stop ever since he, Theodore, Sid and Kane had chased after the Dark Dragoon and had come face to face with Cecil's madness. Being spirited away when Harley had activated the portal had given him his first taste of peace in what felt like days, giving his mind ample opportunity to overwhelm him with fear once again. It had been Harley that had figured out she and himself had been transported into a separate tower from the others. Something about the pattern of the flashing lights had been the giveaway to her fine-tuned mind, but neither she nor Edward knew of another such structure's existence back on the blue planet. And now that Porum had let them know they had gotten themselves trapped, the pressure was on to find a way out and to free the others. He had been wandering about the twisted corridors, wincing every time he turned a corner in anticipation of something horrible waiting for him on the other side. Harley had talked a big game on their behalf when Porum had fretted about their splitting up, but all he could think about was how his last solo adventure had nearly ended in disaster. He had only escaped from the bandit in the underground waterway because he had fallen off the dam bridge like a clumsy fool and somehow managed not to drown. There was no such dumb luck here that could save him, and practically no place to hide if they did encounter an enemy.
My lord.
Edward blinked at the calm voice, turning around. He hadn't realized he had stopped walking and had been staring at the same blank wall for God knows how long.
Harley.
She appeared behind him, her boots echoing on the floor with finality as she smiled slightly.
Taking a break? Not exactly,
Edward shook his head.
Just lost in thought, I guess.
I see, she nodded as if this was a perfectly logical response to have in the middle of a crisis, reaching into her coat.
In that case. I know it is late, but I was wondering if I might be able to hear a song tonight?
When her hand reappeared, she held within a petite golden harp with a spray of emeralds inset at the neck. Edward's eyebrows shot to the ceiling.
Where did you get that? I brought it along when Rydia and the others picked me up,
Harley said, handing it over.
Knowing that you had lost your harp in the waterway, I feared you had run off after Kane and Cecil without one. And of course, I was right, I found your spare at the foot of your bed, as expected.
She found her cheeks tinging pink as the light fell from her lips. Although it was true that she knew Edward well enough to predict he would do something as ridiculous as rushing into battle without a weapon, she of course had had no idea that Rydia and the others would come to see her. She had taken the harp of her own accord after he had left to keep something of his close to her until he had returned home. But now that the real Edward was with her once more, she realized she no longer needed it, and that it was time to come clean, sort of. My spare. Edward's lips twisted as his fingertips gingerly strummed the C-note strings. That was what he had always told Harley that's all this harp was, but the truth was, it had been a relic he had cast away shortly before they had met that had mysteriously made its way to him again. When Anna had died, he had left the harp with her body when he fled Damcyan to join Cecil and Rydia in finding a sand pearl for Rosa. It had been the first harp he had ever owned, the instrument that made him fall in love with music, and the very same harp he had been playing the night he had met Anna. But whoever the kind stranger had been that had eventually stumbled across Anna's body and had given her a proper burial while Edward was recovering in Troya had decided not to bequeath the harp to Anna in the afterlife. With most of the castle destroyed, the Good Samaritan had instead hidden the harp in the castle's former dungeon for safety, one of the only parts of the castle still standing after Golbez had razed it. When one of the children responsible for cleaning out the dungeons had come across the instrument and brought it to Edward, he distinctly remembered feeling as if he had been visited by a ghost. Of course, he had never been able to throw it away, and even after taking it to Anna's grave several times with the intention of leaving it behind, the harp had never quite left his grasp. So, he had ended up hiding it in plain sight, stashing it away in his bedroom like one would have forgotten tchotchke, always close enough to remind him of his ultimate failure.
A song.
Edward choked. At a time like this? She couldn't have been serious. But Harley, for as long as he had known her, had never not been serious, so what she said next was totally expected.
Yes,
Harley nodded. She watched unflinchingly as he lowered the harp to his side and turned his back to her.
I was thinking about giving up the harp, actually,
Edward muttered, and she blinked, pushing her glasses up her nose, as if that would correct her obviously botched hearing.
What?
He could only bring himself to stare at his scuffed boots, even his own darting reflection in the pristine glass tiles at his feet filled him with shame at his cowardice. Yes, he had been doing a lot of thinking ever since his harp had been lost to him. What had once seemed to be an unfortunate accident was starting to take shape as what he interpreted to be a sign from the universe, from his Anna. For a brief moment, he had been overjoyed that he had been able to save Harley, empowered that he alone had been able to penetrate Baron's borders where stronger men than he had failed, but all of that had been quickly stripped away when Kane's attack reminded him that he was a nothing, that he could protect no one, and that ultimately everything he loved would just be taken from him once again, given enough time. He closed his eyes, daring himself not to snap the harp's strings between his fingers that very moment.
One cannot create music when with a heart as disturbed as mine is. Disturbed, my lord.
Harley pressed her fingers to her lips, feeling as if an arctic wind had wrapped itself around her lungs as she unwittingly took a step forward.
Harley,
Edward sighed, lifting his gaze. He could see her pools of navy staring at him wondrously in the reflection of the glass, and that was about as much as he could bear to look at her.
A bard is a man who spins the threads of the past into a musical melody. But I, myself, have yet to come to terms with my past experiences. Not even now.
Harley gritted her teeth, not liking the rise of ugly thoughts that had taken residence in her heart at that moment, a dash of jealousy, tinged with simultaneous disgust and longing. Her rational brain recognized all of those feelings for what they were, but her emotional brain was awash with confusion and heartbreak. It was the same convoluted emotions she had experienced when her parents had died. How many times had she both selfishly and horrifyingly wished it had been her to die instead? How many nights had she spent cursing random strangers in the streets of Troya because everything they had ever known and loved was not sullied by the flames of war? But she had finally arisen from the ashes of destruction, had found her purpose, had found what it was she had quite possibly been left on this planet to achieve, what only she, and no other woman in the world, could do. Her own spiritual rebirth had kindled the revival of an entire nation, and she was reminded that purpose was still not yet fulfilled, not as long as her liege still remained tethered to the ghosts of the past. Never mind this strange ache in my heart, the heart. No, the very soul of Damcyan herself cries in agony alongside her king. Even if we do save the planet, Damcyan will not be long for this world as long as Edward suffers so. Rational Harley won out, and she extinguished the rage in her gaze as she rested her hands on her hips. She was amazed at the tenacity and stillness of her tone even as the words tumbled out in an anxious spill.
Well, what makes you think that matters at all?
Edward bit his lip, something in Harley's voice finally bringing himself to turn around and face her. She was staring at him unflinchingly, the slightest stain of pink rising in the apples of her cheeks. Her normally impeccable, severe bun was hanging at the nape of her neck, stray strands of shiny azure framing her face, and he could see the tiniest smudge in the reflection of the pulsing tower light in her glasses. One of the fasteners on her jacket had been ripped away, exposing a slender curve of the purple tunic beneath. Her leggings were scuffed and torn, exposing snippets of alabaster, smooth skin. Never before had he seen her so utterly exposed. Laid bare. His mind flashed back to Harley agonizing in the throes of fever in Capo, and he realized that the woman standing before him now of sound mind and body was yet more vulnerable than the wisp of a girl on her deathbed. And the chaos in his heart rose to a fever pitch. Harley pursed her lips.
People are soothed by your song, my lord. They learn from it, and they are emboldened by it. I too am no exception to that.
Edward's heart skipped a beat, her name came out as a hushed whisper.
Harley.
She reached up, removing her glasses as eyelashes began to glisten with tears. On autopilot, she stroked the lenses with the hem of her coat as she kept her eyes trained on his.
My lord. Do you still wish to deny your gift? Would you ignore everything you have accomplished, even now? No, that's not what. You know well, of course, that I lost both of my parents in the last war.
He knew, she had said as much in her letter to him, after all, but it had also been an unspeakable pleasure to learn every little thing he could about her when the Chancellor had forced a background check before she could be formally hired on as his aide. But it turned out, he didn't know everything about her past after all.
But I still found hope in my life to keep on living. Thanks to your song.
Harley smiled slightly through her tears.
The first night I heard it, much like you, I suppose, my heart was disturbed. I was still mourning the loss of my parents, and yet I had just been gifted with the promise of a new family. The ring weighed heavily on my hand as I crossed the entryway gardens of Troya Castle. But when I heard the morning notes of your song coming from the westmost tower, something inside of me came alive. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was the spark of new light, the birth of a star inside my heart.
Edward's eyes widened. Harley was engaged to be wed? And to have heard my song in Troya. That was long before I came home from the war. Could that mean?
And your song? Your hope? It's what led me back home to Demsion.
Harley flushed.
I know now that if the past had been any different from what it turned out to be, then this moment, this instant in time would be irrevocably changed, I imagine, from what we are living right now. So please, don't.
She was interrupted when Edward suddenly threw his arms around her, pressing her head to his shoulder as he buried his lips in her hair. She closed her eyes, her fingers sinking into his cape as her words became muted by warmth of his body against her mouth.
You are right.
Edward murmured, resisting with everything he had to not inhale all of her scent.
I'm so sorry, Harley. You've suffered as much as I, and yet you've always been so much stronger. If I could only draw from your well of strength.
A sheen of ebony light washed over Edward, and Harley blinked away her tears, glancing up. A glimmering crystal had arisen behind them, a depthless black that seemed to somehow suck in all of the artificial light coursing in the tower's walls. Edward caught the gasp in Harley's throat and whirled around, his own throat clenching as a massive fracture suddenly ripped through the crystal, a howl of wind tossing back Edward and Harley's hair as the crystal shattered and gave birth to a lithe shadow. The shadow writhed as it poured upward from the floor beneath the broken crystal shards, taking the shape of two long, svelte legs that melded into concave hips and a chest that looked as if it had been hand-carved from the marble of statuesque goddess. A bounty of yellow hair sprung from the top of the shadow, spinning around the forming body like a vortex as the creature's face finally came into view. Lamp-like yellow-green eyes were fixated on Edward and Harley, pink pouty lips slicked with gloss and a slightly upturned nose wrinkling in confusion. The woman, or whatever she was, before them was stunning, in a feral way. Her mouth curled into a wicked grin, exposing a slightly crooked left incisor, as the vortex of hair fell away from her body and exposed a tiny strip of ebony steel that composed of her bikini top, an even tinier strip gracing her pelvis acting as the corresponding bottom.
Who are you?
Edward blinked, and the woman laughed in response, her chest heaving so vigorously that Harley was concerned she might lose an eye.
Yes. I am an archfiend,
she declared, her voice shaking with a strange hesitance.
You may call me Barbaricia.
Raising her hands, the entire room suddenly became engulfed in a maelstrom of wind, her hair wrapping back around her body as Edward and Harley were effortlessly lifted from their feet and slammed into the wall 10 feet behind them. Harley screamed as her head smashed into the plated glass, feeling her glasses crunch in half between her clenched fingers. Edward grimaced through the pain, his mind reeling as spills of black bloomed in his vision.
She must be the fiend who controls wind.
Edward moaned, and Harley looked over at him, her body wincing with effort.
Fiend. Cecil told me about them. Archfiends who once followed Golbez and held sway over each of the elements,
he explained.
Same as the crystals. A fiend that controls fire, water, earth, and wind. But that would mean Cecil would have defeated her during the war,
Harley gasped.
So how could she be here, now? The Empress of the Tower of Zot is not slain so easily,
Barbariccia hissed, a ribbon of hair suddenly shooting forth and wrapping around Harley's neck. Harley let out another scream as she was lifted from the floor and drawn back to Barbariccia, her fingers grasping at the rapidly replicating fibers of silken hair cutting off her oxygen supply.
Harley!
Edward cried, forcing himself to his feet as Barbariccia let escape another peal of laughter and sent another torrent of gales Edward's way, throwing him back into the wall as Harley's kicking feet began to stiffen and fade into a pale gray. He realized through the blinding wind that Harley's strength was failing her as the pallor raised up her leggings and hips, she was gradually being petrified. Harley tossed her head back, desperately gasping for breath as her lips began to turn blue. At this rate, she would likely suffocate before she had completely turned to stone. What can I possibly do? Edward frowned, his hand brushing over the knife hanging from his waist as he pictured the blade severing the weave of hair gushing from the fiend. There's no way I can get near her with this thing. And if I throw it, the winds will return it right to my chest. The howl of the wind grew louder, and Edward clenched his teeth, forced to turn away from Harley's suffering as the gales stung his eyes mercilessly. Cecil told me that Cain and Barbariccia had struck up a rivalry when he was under Golbez's thrall. It was only Cain's ability to fight in the air that saved them from her wrath the first time. If only I had a way to fight in the air as well.
Ed. Ward.
Harley whimpered. Her cry was barely audible over the storm, and yet Edward had managed to pick up on it immediately. It had been the first time in his life that she had ever called him by his name to his face without an honorific or title. He felt his fingertips grow hot, and looked down at his left hand, which was still, somehow, clinging to the harp Harley had brought him. As Harley's voice drifted over the wind, the strings on the harp resonated ever so slightly, glowing a pale blue.
What they?
Edward whispered, lifting the harp with much effort as the winds tried to pin him back against the wall. Maybe I can't fight in the air, like Cain. But my music can be carried across the planet using air and sound waves. Just like when I broke the Dark Elf's control over his magnetic field. He turned slightly to shield the harp and his hands from the wind, closing his eyes as he tried to recall a certain bard song he had learned long, long ago. He knew songs for disarming Fae, like the Dark Elf, but this archfiend was way beyond the power level of a monster like that. He knew songs for sleep, for vigor, and for stamina, but the song he was searching for in the archives of his memory was one that he had not played since he had been engaged to Anna. He had not needed to use it since Anna had passed away 17 years prior. It had been difficult for her to sneak out and about to see him for their clandestine dates, even more difficult than it was for him. As rarely seen royalty, Edward could usually sneak about donning his bard disguise, and most villagers wouldn't believe that their prince was just randomly mingling in the village even if he was recognized. But Anna was well known and much loved as the daughter of the great sage Tella and recognized by everyone in the village. She couldn't sneeze without someone informing her father. And so, Edward had learned of and tirelessly practiced a song with origins in Eblanesan ninjutsu magic, a song that would cast an illusion on the listener and cause them to be seen as someone else for as long as he played. It was usually just enough to help Anna slip through the streets without being stopped or seen, and once they were free of Capo's borders, Edward would cease the music and whisk her away in his hovercraft to Damsion. I don't know this Barbariccia, or how she could appear in a place like this. But there may be one person that could talk her down from this madness, someone on this very moon that may have unknowingly awakened her from her slumber. A melancholy tune with striking, eerie notes began to dance over the strings of the harp. Edward's eyes still closed as he let himself drown in the terror he had experienced upon first laying eyes on Golbez. He had been a man that had filled the entirety of the sky, his cloak lined in the deepest nightshade billowing in the wind of the airship he was commandeering as volleys of flame engulfed Damsion. Edward had only been able to observe him for a few moments through the destroyed roof of the throne room before he heard Anna's dying cry, her falling body pierced with an arrow that had been meant for him. As the music rode the winds swirling about the chamber in what was quickly forming into a massive tornado, Barbaricia clutched at her face, digging her fingertips into her temples as she sank to her knees, her hair quickly retreating back into her scalp and dropping a half-petrified Harley to the floor. Harley grunted as her stone-leaden half crashed into the tiles, gasping for breath and pressing her fingers into the raw, reddened flesh around her throat. Barbaricia crawled to Harley on her hands and knees, lowering her head as spun gold poured over her bare white shoulders.
Master Golbez, I thank you for coming here. Now, I am myself once again. Hey.
Harley blinked, her now totally loose hair fluttering back down over her face and shoulders as the winds began to die. Barbaricia reached up gingerly, cupping Harley's face and brushing her fingers through Harley's thick waves. Harley glanced back at Edward in muted horror, and Edward shot her a look that said, "Just go with it," nodding toward the harp he was strumming. Harley didn't quite get what was happening, but realizing that Edward's music probably had something to do with her no longer being choked to death, she decided to resist challenging him, just for this one time.
Barbaricia,
Harley began, her tongue tripping over the fiend's name as she struggled to think of what to say that wouldn't send her into a literal tailspin, something that Golbez might say, too, so she would not break whatever illusion Edward was weaving. She finally settled on contrition.
Forgive me for not being here sooner. No, no.
Barbaricia shook her head, acid green tears running down her cheeks that made Harley cringe about getting much closer, not that she had much of a choice, being that her legs were still petrified solid and Barbaricia was clinging to her for dear life.
I am overjoyed to see you again. I am sorry for not recognizing you. This body, it's a meaningless shell. What?
Harley frowned.
I don't understand. Though my corporeal form was returned to the planet long ago, this Barbaricia will never forget your kindness to me, Master. The soul you saved will live on forever in the breath of the planet itself. The soul I saved,
Harley mumbled, and Barbaricia nodded.
The raw pain of it all can still be felt in my heart, even as it ceased to beat long ago. The villagers called me a witch, called me an abomination, all because I could hear the secrets of the wind, because I could feel the planet's spirit within my own, because I loved one who was forbidden to me. My beautiful love was struck down before my eyes, and I was run out of our village, banished to a hell of my own making, knowing that I had been the one to cause her to die and knowing that I would never hear her voice carry my name on the winds ever again. And then you found me. Drifting arduously between the realms of the living and the dead, all you did was extend your hand, and within I found all that I thought I had lost forevermore. You gave me purpose. And saved me from dying alone. For those two small things, I will be eternally in your debt.
Harley whimpered, lowering her head. She knew Barbaricia wasn't really talking to her, and that if the fiend recognized Harley for what she really was, she would be flat on her back in a pool of her own blood with the snap of a finger. But if the circumstances had been just slightly different? Would she have ever ended up like this fiend, as well? All it might have taken was one twist of fate. For just one event in her life to tilt her heart to darkness. It had happened to Barbaricia. Cain. And Golbez too, she was sure. There was no way a man suffering through contrition as fierce as what she had witnessed in her short time with him was someone that was simply born evil. If the hand extended toward her own when she had been inwardly fading away had been anyone else's.
No one deserves the piercing sting of loneliness, no matter who they may love,
Harley finally said, reaching up to hold her hand over Barbaricia's, which was still entangled in her hair.
I am glad that in the end, you weren't alone. And you shan't be alone now, either. Return to your eternal slumber, Barbaricia. I will stay with you until the end. Thank you, Master.
Barbaricia smiled through her tears.
I hope that someday, you will get to be with the one you love most, too.
She leaned in, pressing her lips to Harley's and closing her eyes. Harley nearly fell back in shock, her face erupting in a blush as a warm, tingly sensation returned to her torso and legs, indicating that she was slowly being healed from her petrification. Edward was so stunned that he stopped playing, every drop of blood in his body rushing to his head as his jaw dropped to the floor. Harley felt the pressure on her mouth lighten as Barbaricia faded away in a pool of glittering ebony light, leaving behind only a long lock of silken hair beautifully braided with a hilt that looked much like that of a whip. Harley hesitated as she picked it up, giving it a crack and nearly jumping out of her own boots as the echo erupted within the hall and produced a glowing portal in the place of the shattered crystal.
Whoa.
Edward could only manage to gasp, pocketing his harp and racing to Harley's side. He knelt down, grasping her hand in his own and breathlessly tugging her to her feet. Embarrassingly enough, he found his gaze immediately drawn to her reddened, slightly swollen lips, and suddenly and quite inappropriately felt himself wishing he could ask Barbariccia what Harley had tasted like. It took several long beats of Harley staring up at him questioningly before he sputtered out a lame comment.
So, the song must have worked. She really thought you were Golbez. It's a shame,
Harley frowned as she turned the golden whip over in her fingers.
If Golbez had been the one to actually hear all of that. You can tell him in person,
Edward offered, pushing a lock of hair behind her ear before he could stop himself. With her glasses no longer in the way, his fingertip could ever so slightly trace the curve of her auricle as he pulled his hand away.
He must be close if her soul reacted so powerfully to the spell. I had feared all this time that the others may eventually chase after us, but perhaps this means our luck is changing. If Golbez, Cain, Rosa, and Theodore have joined forces, then we'll surely be out of this labyrinth in no time. Right?
Harley nodded, looking toward the portal that had opened before them.
Speaking of which, I had a thought. Hello? Can anyone hear us?
An anxious female voice burst out of Edward's vest, and Harley covered her hand with her mouth, giggling at the absurd timing of the interruption. Edward blinked, pulling out the whisperweed and staring at it as if he had totally forgotten about the three people on the other end of the line. Harley had to admit that for a moment, she had forgotten about them too. Barbariccia's sad tale and parting kiss had deposited Harley into her own little chaotic universe.
Leonora, is that you? Why yes, Your Highness. I'm afraid we've had a bit of an incident. What?
Edward gasped, and Harley immediately stopped laughing, her face paling.
Are you okay? Why yes,
Leonora stuttered.
It's just that. A portal suddenly manifested in the room we were trapped in, and it was under Leonora's rear.
Palom roared in the background, and Edward and Harley could hear Leonora whimper in embarrassment.
Honestly,
a new voice came through, Porums.
Ugh. Anyway, Leonora fell through the portal, so of course my brother and I went after her. But now, we're no longer in a tower, unfortunately, we've been transported to a place we're a little too familiar with, it looks to be Mount Ordeals. My word,
Harley frowned.
I've heard all about Mount Ordeals. It's crawling with the undead, right? Yes,
Porum's voice broke up a little as she replied. Suddenly, she sounded as if she were a million miles away.
Where? ARandomAudiobookAppeared. The Tower of Zot, apparently,
Edward said.
A new portal has opened up here too. We'll enter it, and hopefully meet you on the mountain. We'll keep our eyes peeled,
Porum began, but the connection finally fizzled out and went dead. Edward lowered the whisperweed, peering at Harley over the blooms.
You were saying something before they patched in. Oh, yes,
Harley blinked. She had quite nearly forgotten.
These portals. It felt quite odd traveling through the first one, did it not? We weren't in it very long, but then we were deposited somewhere that would normally be impossible to reach in such a time span. I don't know the origins of the Tower of Zot, but like Leonora guessed before, I agree that this is all just a series of illusions. It is all bizarre, how we've seemingly been separated from the others on purpose.
Edward frowned.
It's most likely that Rydia and Edge were taken somewhere else, too. But if we aren't getting transported to real places, what's happening? The crystals have been gathered,
Harley sighed.
Which means the interdimensional elevator has been activated, right? I think these portals are a facet of that, stops on the route between the blue planet and wherever the core of this moon lies. But it's not taking us anywhere on the blue planet, it's taking us to dimensions, falsely disguised as locales from our planet. I think if we keep going, we're going to end up meeting the one who wanted the crystals in the first place. We're dimension hopping.
Edward crossed his arms in thought.
And this portal only appeared after the crystal shattered. Which means 2 other crystals must have shattered before when our group split up,
Harley finished.
So, the others must be here, somewhere, the crystals only seem to react when we, the enemy of this moon, is nearby. And they could be in terrible danger, if those crystals are giving birth to creatures like Barbariccia.
Edward shook his head.
We must hurry, time is running out for Cecil.
He grabbed Harley's hand, and she felt her pulse strangely quicken as she stepped toward him.
Ready for the next one?
She gazed into the light of the portal, mentally preparing herself for the next rush her body was about to undertake. She supposed that receiving a kiss from a female archfiend had sufficiently removed any of her irrational fears about anything that could possibly be thrown at her next, and she had been so embarrassed for it to happen in front of Edward that she supposed that boundary of chasteness between them had been pulverized as well. Indeed, if they made it back to Damcyan in one piece, many new turns would need to be navigated in their relationship, whatever form it ended up taking. It made her stomach twist in a longing, torturous way just thinking about it. She found herself squeezing his hand, the vision of the king before her as clear as ever, despite her lack of glasses. She would no longer let herself look away from what was most obviously and maddeningly before her, no matter how much she might long to go back to simpler days. The past has settled and lays bare before me future. Every action I have taken in this life has led me to this irrevocable moment in time. Has led me to him. She tilted her head, surprisingly enjoying the way the strands of her loose hair tickled her cheek and brushed across the back of her neck.
Ready as I'll ever be.
Leonora collapsed on the ledge of a cliff, pressing her hand to her forehead as she tilted her chin and allowed herself the luxury of a deep, belabored breath. They had just cut through a small army of undead, and even though Palem's flames, along with her and Porum's white magic, had made the task of destroying them all achievable, she was still shaken and left exhausted. Palom had been taking advantage of using every battle as a training opportunity, and he shamelessly pushed Leonora into front and center of every battle. The mixed effort of having to listen to Palem's coaching, if she were being generous with her descriptors, and fighting for her life, positively drained her. She was eternally thankful that Porum had been keeping a close and obvious eye on her, and finally ordered Leonora to go ahead and find them a safe place to rest while she and her brother took care of any stragglers. There's still so much I have to learn about magic. Did the epochs make a mistake, accepting me as one of their own? I'm beginning to feel as if I'm a fraud. What in the world am I doing here, in a place like this, burdening my teacher? He's not going to be around when I formally take on my duties. What am I supposed to do then? She heard the crunch of footsteps and twisted her torso to see Porum approaching. Palom, it seemed, was absent, although she couldn't hear his maddening, but at the same time, kind of endearing, cackle he liked to emit when toasting zombies. He must have found another battle to dive into farther away.
Lady Porum.
Leonora scrambled to her feet, realizing it was probably not very respectful for her to loaf about in Porum's presence.
Porum is fine,
Porum smiled, gesturing with her hand for Leonora to sit back down. Leonora stared at her hand and felt herself start to go into another dithering fit. She wasn't sure if it would be more disrespectful to ignore Porum's offer to sit back down or to sit and force the mage to talk down at her like a petulant child.
Oh, no, no.
Leonora squeaked.
I couldn't speak to you in such a tone. You are the great white mage of my citya, my lady.
Porum chuckled. Suddenly, she could see what it was Palom liked so much about this girl. She had breached the boundary of thinking Leonora was purposely naive to realize that her earnestness and desire to see others happy were truly authentic, a rare trait nowadays among such powerful wizardry. There was no doubt in Porum's mind anymore that Leonora simply wore her heart on her billowing, oversized silk sleeve.
No, please, call me Porum. The same way you refer to Palom. It's fine, really. Are you sure? Porum.
Leonora blinked, and Porum grinned.
Hee hee. Well, if you insist, I'm not going to stop you. Why yes, my lady.
Leonora squeaked again, and clapped her hand over her mouth, sighing.
I will work on that. What were you thinking about?
Porum asked, trying to be merciful and changing the subject. Leonora stared down at the rocky shelf of the cliff, pressing her lips together.
Well, are you sure this is all right? Taking an epoch trainee like myself on a journey like this?
Porum blinked, crossing her arms over her chest.
Is it all right? Palom recommended you. What?
Leonora met Porum's gaze, her eyes wide.
He gave me a very convincing account of your natural talents,
Porum smiled.
He talked about how, as your teacher, he feels responsible for your development. Really? Millimeter hum.
Leonora shook her head wondrously. Palom had really said such kind words about her?
I really can't believe it.
Porum tilted her head, biting down on her lip.
Are you regretting the journey? Oh, no.
Leonora jumped a little, shaking her head anxiously.
Not at all. I mean, I was worried about being a burden to you all, but I'm truly happy to be here. I'm so happy, in fact, that I've forgotten about how scared I should be right now.
And that was the truth. Never in the entirety of her time with Palom had she felt scared of what was to come. She had been too focused on trying to keep up with the twins and in awe of the incredible power she had the privilege to witness.
That's really good to hear.
Palom nodded, and Leonora blinked.
Oh. I think I'm starting to understand why Palom hasn't brought up his dream of becoming a sage lately,
Palom muttered, and Leonora pressed her lips together. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to know about Palom's dream. It seemed to be common enough knowledge that Rydia and Palom spoke about it freely, but in their time together, Palom had never once mentioned it to Leonora directly, and she couldn't help but feel as if there was a reason for that. She decided to play dumb for now.
What? And just what are you two talking about?
A curious crackling sound rang out in the air behind them, similar to the pop of fire in a blaze. Terrified to turn around, Leonora watched Palom's eyes darken as the reflection of a new figure formed within. The girl's mouth twisted in confusion. Bracing herself, Leonora mentally counted to 3 and whirled around, shocked to see what looked like a familiar face half floating over the ledge of the cliff. The gray-blue sky that had previously been surrounding them was blinking erratically from blue to black in a small patch a few feet above the cliffside, similar to the failing monitors on the lunar whale when their ship had been pulled into the enemy's tractor beam. Leonora couldn't see the entirety of the person who had appeared before them, but her scowl was recognizable enough, as was the shock of bright red hair.
Oh, it's...
Leonora breathed, and Palom stepped forward, flabbergasted.
Luca. In the flesh.
Luca nodded, and the girls could see her shift a bit. Maybe she was crossing her arms.
Look, I'm just gonna ask. Do you like Palom, or what?
The blood drained from Leonora's face, and the back of her neck suddenly felt damp from a deluge of sweat. It was obvious who Luca was addressing the question to, certainly not Palom's twin sister.
What? That's a rather sudden question. Especially, given the circumstances of your appearance here. Luca.
Palom gasped, shaking her head.
Why you were here? And safe, I presume? Where are the others? Everyone I left with is still here and accounted for.
Luca nodded behind her, as if any of them could actually see.
But we'll get to that in a minute. What were you saying, Leonora? You don't have to answer her.
Palom sighed, but Leonora shook her head, clenching her fists.
No. I have nothing to hide. I simply meant that I admire and, respect. I mean, as a teacher. That is,
Luca shook her head, pinching the bridge of her nose with her fingertips.
I'm not asking for all the gory details. You like him, don't you? It's a simple question.
And just like that, Leonora shrugged and offered up a serene smile. Luca was right, it was a simple question, and she had an equitably simple answer.
Well, yes. Yes, I do.
If Palom had a drink in her hands, it would be sprayed all over the mountain. Her eyeballs darted between Leonora, who was gazing up at Luca patiently, and Luca, who looked as if a fuse had been lit beneath her bottom. After a few moments, Luca lowered her hand, and gave Leonora a smile in return.
Hey.
Leonora and Palom burst out in unison, and Luca let out a deep breath, shaking her head.
That makes me feel a lot better. What? What do you mean?
Leonora blinked. And once more, she found herself utterly confused. Across from footbridge that Leonora and Palom had crossed to reach the temporary campsite, Palom was shrinking behind a boulder, barely able to control the shaking in his limbs as he strained forward as much as humanly possible to try to hear the girls' conversation. At first, he had planned on just marching over to Palom and Leonora to collect them and move on to the summit of the mountain, but when he had heard his name fall from Palom's lips, he decided a little espionage might be in order, first. And then suddenly, the sky behind the girls had torn apart, or short-circuited, was perhaps a better way of describing it, and a looming, menacing image of Luca had appeared. That was when he had hightailed it for safety. If she spotted him, she would announce his presence to the entire mountain with that big mouth of hers. At first, while Luca was talking to Leonora, she looked as if she were going to reach through space and throttle the Epop's throat, but then in the blink of an eye, the two of them were suddenly smiling and carrying on like nothing had happened. Try as he might, Palom couldn't figure out just what the hell had happened. Women can be fearsome things, sometimes, he thought, shaking his head.
Luca.
Rydia finally managed to shove her way through the study room door Luca had hastily barricaded, blowing it apart with a fierce spell. An explosion of smoking wood rained from the ceiling as Rydia stomped up to the flickering bookcase Luca was facing, peering down at what appeared to be a seizing portrait of Porum and Leonora on a mountainside cliff.
What in the world is going on?
Rydia cried.
Luca, why did you lock me out? Sorry.
Luca flushed and waved her hand as if dismissing Rydia's grievances.
I was just exploring this room and the bookcase suddenly went crazy, flashing and flickering like a strobe. I was afraid a monster was trying to come out, so I locked myself in to keep you guys safe. But turns out, it was just these two.
Oh brother, Rydia thought, her eyes narrowed. I'm sure it took Luca only mere moments to realize what was happening, and I've been banging on that door for the past 3 minutes. She definitely locked me out on purpose. But she decided now was not the time for semantics. She tried to remind herself of Luca's kindness to her on the rooftop so that she didn't wind up introducing the princess to the other end of her whip.
Hi, Lady Rydia.
Leonora called, raising her hand. Rydia raised hers in return. She couldn't help but notice the sharp scent of metal in the air that overpowered the rows of ancient, dusty tomes before them, just like the cavern she had woken up in.
You two look so close, but sound so far away.
Rydia frowned, pressing her hands against the flickering books. Instead of falling through air, like she had been expecting, her fingers hit something smooth and cold, like glass. The glowing red beacon of light they had been chasing had at long last given way to a familiar building at the end of the scattered Feymarch cityscape, the library Rydia had lived in with Leviathan and Azura a lifetime ago. The group had decided to split up and explore all of the rooms before descending into the basement. Rydia was already terrified of what might be awaiting them there, and wanted to put it off as long as possible.
And you look like you're a floating head,
Porum sighed.
What in the world is happening?
Perhaps the same thing that happened to Ursula and Theodore, Rydia thought, and rushed to explain to the girls everything that had happened to them so far in the false Feymarch. In turn, Porum shared their tale, explaining that Palom was off somewhere on the mountain trying to clear away zombies so that they could find a way out and be reunited with Edward and Harley, neither of whom had shown up after they had last spoken. The Whisperweed had remained dead, and Porum wondered aloud if the two of them ended up being transported somewhere very far away, instead of following them to Mount Ordeals. When the four women had finished exchanging stories, Luca piped up.
You know, something about the way this bookshelf looks reminds me an awful lot of the circuitry inside Kalka and Brina when I have to fix them. And it smells like metal in here,
Rydia frowned.
Which is totally out of place in an ancient library. I don't remember ever smelling anything like this when I lived here. This is an odd detail for whoever created this place to get wrong when everything else is nearly so perfect. Maybe this is an accident,
Leonora offered.
On our end, it looks like a chunk of the sky has been cut away. Whoever is trying to show us these things must be struggling with keeping up the illusion. Maybe there are more of us wandering around than they bargained for. That makes sense,
Luca nodded. An idea was starting to bubble up in her brain, one that was absolutely terrifying, but seemed plausible given everything Leonora and Porum had just shared with them, plus the experience of meeting Theodore that Ursula had relayed.
I wonder.
But her trail of thought was interrupted when Palom came bounding up to Porum and Leonora, loudly announcing his arrival before actually appearing in a place that Rydia and Luca could see him.
We need to make tracks before any more of those monsters trace us,
Palom said, giving a nonchalant wave to the two figures floating above him like it was nothing.
We're close to the summit. If they wanted to trap us, that would be the ideal place to do so. You were always good being able to think like the enemy,
Porum said dryly.
Good thing you're on our side, I guess. What are you going to do?
Leonora asked, and Rydia and Luca glanced at each other.
I suppose we'll continue searching the library for an exit,
Rydia said, and Luca nodded.
Have faith, you guys. If something like this happened, it means we're more interconnected than we previously thought. The enemy wants us to think we're far apart, but this is proof that we're not totally isolated from each other. A few more slip UPS, and that might give us enough to crack the code and figure out how to find each other again. You're right.
Porum smiled.
Take care of yourselves, I'm sure we'll see you all very soon. You too,
Rydia said, and she and Luca watched as the three mages turned and made their way north. Luca flinched as Rydia spun to face her, but the rage from being locked out before had already left Rydia's body. She merely threw her arms around Luca, realizing how hard it had probably been at that moment for the girl to watch the love of her life walk away with someone else. Luca hugged Rydia back tightly, forcing out a little laugh that Rydia could tell had the slightest tinge of regret. When they reunited with the others in the main alcove of the library, Rydia warily eyed the narrow stairs that would take them to Leviathan and Azura's throne room.
The last place to check here my home, for many wonderful years. Very few humans have ever graced the royal family's chamber. Just Cecil, Kane, Rosa, and...
Her throat clenched when it came to Edge's name. She was more worried about him now than ever. They had somehow managed to stumble upon Theodore and the others. Wasn't Edge trying to find her?
Do you want to go unescorted?
Yang asked gently.
Do you feel it will anger their majesties if you bring us along? No.
Rydia lied. Yang had nailed it, but she had to force herself to remember this wasn't the real Feymarch, and therefore, she was breaking no one's rules. There wasn't even a guarantee that Azura and Leviathan were still alive to be furious at her for an imaginary transgression. I can't give in to despair. I have to remember. My last memory of them alive wasn't of them banishing me. It was of them saving my life. It was of Azura showing me how to save the others before I even knew what was happening. When Rydia reached up to brush the hyacinth the mist dragon had bestowed upon her, she felt a chill run down her spine as the last few petals fluttered to the floor, defeated by the overwhelming heat. Silently, she turned to go down the stairs, giving a slight nod when Yang and the others made the motion to follow her. As she crossed the threshold to the throne room, all of the churning tension that had clenched at her stomach with each step she took down the stairs rushed out of her like the air being released from a balloon. Lying about in a proverbial pool of her own radiance and opulence, as regal as ever, was Queen Azura, her eyes closed as if she were in the middle of a wonderful catnap. As soon as Rydia's boot hit the crystalline tiles of the chamber, Azura's ever-vigilant violet eyes snapped open, and she lifted herself from her throne of pillows, fixating her gaze directly on Rydia as a string of diamonds gently slid down her collar and nestled between the swell of her breasts, one teardrop-shaped orb exposed outside the sling of her canary-yellow gown, just like always. Absent was the cold, hard, flint-like stare of the other Eidolons Rydia had desperately fought to free. Even Azura's complexion was awash with her usual pearl-pink color.
Your Majesty!
Rydia exclaimed, rushing up to the queen and throwing her arms around her and practically diving into the pillows in the process.
Oh, thank heavens you're safe.
I can feel it. Azura's heart beating against my own. She's alive. The only real thing in this farce of a village. Azura said nothing as she stared down at Rydia, a twitch in her eye going unnoticed as she noted the absence of the ruby hyacinth in the girl's hair. Silently, Yang, Ursula, Sid, and Luca hung back at the stairwell, not quite sure if making their presence known would help or hinder the reunion. After a few moments, Rydia peered up at Azura, smiling a little as her gaze caught the queen's. Rydia felt a pinch in her side, followed a rush of something warm and wet. Time dragged to a standstill as she forced her gaze away from Azura and looked down at her lap, where the queen's bejeweled fist had swiftly and silently nestled a switchblade into the curve of her stomach, sending a cascade of blood spilling into her folded legs. Her lower lip quivering, all Rydia could think to do was dip her fingers into the blood to ensure that it wasn't another twisted illusion. Azura yanked the blade free, letting it drop to the floor with a clatter as Rydia stared up at her, white-faced and paralyzed.
Your Majesty! This has got to be a joke, right?
Edge let out a growl and kicked at the severed head of a clockwork soldier, sending it careening over the bridge that he had only just previously run across to reach the crystal chamber of the Tower of Babel. Now, he was back here once more, the only difference from last time being that the Eblin Four were actually following him this time, rather than poorly stalking him.
Why would that portal just take us back to this floor?
Izayoi shook her head.
I thought for sure it was the way out of here. Did you do this to all of these monsters, Master?
Tsukinawa blinked, towing another still mechanical body. He didn't really remember Edge being so effective with the monsters when they had been watching their master from the shadows, but maybe Edge had been so stealthy in one of his counterattacks that Tsukinawa had blinked and missed something. Hardly, Edge admitted, only now just realizing that it was sort of odd that so many bodies were scattered about. He had taken out a few soldiers, of course, but the clamor he had heard once he had escaped to the crystal chamber indicated to him that plenty were still milling about before the crystals had shattered. He had figured that most of them would shove each other off the bridge in a rush to get to him, but the number of bodies and body parts scattered about the pristine tiles of the tower said otherwise.
There are scorch marks on some of them,
Zangetsu pointed out, lifting a severed arm that had been stained mostly black.
And it smells like fire in here.
Gekao took a long, deep breath.
Like a flame I've smelled before. But I can't put my finger on it. Fires really smell different to you.
Edge blinked.
How is this something I don't know? If I may be frank, Master, you're not exactly detail-oriented. Fair enough,
Edge shrugged, turning back to the sea of bodies before them.
If we go back into that crystal chamber, are we just going to have to fight more monsters? Because I'm not really in the mood.
The idea had only occurred to him when recalled what had happened when they had entered the portal after his parents had departed. At first, he had been embraced by a chilly, yet comforting light, millions of pinpricks of light rushing by as he rocketed into the stars. Just as a blossom of pale blue light reached the peripheral of Edge's vision, there came a flash of red, and a seething heat that nearly knocked him out as it burned the fringes of his lungs. When he next opened his eyes, he found himself back in the Tower of Babel once more, with 4 confused ninjas at his side. Scorch marks. Flames. But of course. He's finally shown himself. I guess what happened before with Ifrit was just a preview of what was to come.
There will be another crystal inside that chamber,
Edge pointed toward the sealed doors.
I think I understand now. As always, history repeats itself. What do you mean?
Gekao asked.
What's supposed to happen next? After I fought mutations of my parents in the Tower of Babel 17 years ago, I confronted the fiend whose associate desecrated their corpses and who was responsible for lighting Evelyn aflame. Together, Cecil and I defeated him. But he's been leaving me little love notes as of late, and I think he wants me back.
He thought of the blistering panic attacks that had knocked him out in the cave of Evelyn, the warning from his parents before they had confronted the mysterious girl in the tower, and the incident in Evelyn. A small part of Edge had thought he was just becoming crazy and obsessive over the tower being alit once more, but suddenly, everything made sense. It would have been extremely satisfying for him if he didn't realize what that meant was waiting for him inside the crystal chamber. The seneschal's menacing warning rang in his ears.
But Cecil and the others aren't with you now. The fiend of fire that destroyed Evelyn is inside.
Izayoi cracked her knuckles.
Perfect. I'm ready, Master. No.
Edge cried, backing over the bridge so he could face them as he spoke.
I want to handle this one by myself. You're going to take on an archfiend by yourself.
Gekao raised an eyebrow.
If we're talking about repeating the past, doesn't that bode ill for you?
Edge shook his head.
Call me reckless. I don't care. But this is my battle to fight. And that is an order. But Master, we just said we would do this together.
Tsukinawa protested.
We promised your parents. If something happens to you, I'm not so foolish as to let anything happen to me,
Edge growled.
You have my word, if that means anything, anymore, that I will shatter that crystal and make it out alive. Please, understand that this is something I have to do. If I'm not to be chained to the past anymore, I must sever those bonds with my own hands. But...
Zangetsu gasped, and to Edge's surprise, Gekao shook his head, raising his hand for silence.
You've heard our master's orders. Anyone who attempts to disobey will have to face me.
Thank you, Gekao. Edge gave a slight smile, turning on his heel and sprinting the rest of the way down the bridge. This time, the mechanical doors slid open for him effortlessly, like he was an expected guest, and slammed shut just as quickly behind him. Sure enough, as he had anticipated, the center dais was alit with a pillar of light. Forming within its core was another of the dread ebony crystals. Edge could feel the temperature of the room skyrocket, and yanked away his cowl to combat the sweat that was already starting to pool at his collar. Forgive me, my faithful guard, please don't think I would turn my back on our promises so easily. I understand now what it was Ruby Khan wanted me to find, and now it's time to show him once and for all. My true flame, the reason why I fight, it's for all of you, my brothers in arms, my friends, and the one I love. No longer am I clouded by delusions that only I can complete what must be done on this moon, but I am the only one who can forgive myself. And the only one who can free myself from the prison of my own making.
Ruby Kent.
Edge's thunderous growl roared over the escalating heat and the columns of flames that had begun to lick the chamber walls.
I'm ready for you, now. Don't disappoint me.
Palom crossed the final bridge that linked Mount Ordeal's summit to the shrine that had once been erected long ago for the Father of Magic, whose son, the Holy Paladin, had once crossed the space-time bounds of the shrine to obtain the power of the light that would go on to save their world from Zemus's darkness. At the time, Palom had not thought much of the phenomenon he had witnessed. It was a miracle, to be sure, but he had only been sent along with Porum to spy on Cecil, and didn't think much would come of his journey one way or the other. But seeing the shrine again, after so long, even if he knew in his heart that it was a fake, he still felt an indescribable rush of awe flood his veins. If Cecil hadn't stumbled into Mysidia that fateful day, half drowned and on the brink of losing everything he held dear, Palom knew he wouldn't be standing where he was right now, and that certain people wouldn't be by his side, either, people he hadn't realized he needed until it was already too late to turn back.
It looks exactly as it did when I went to Mount Ordeal's a few days ago to find Cain,
Porum said softly, breaking Palom out of his self-induced trance.
How could someone know to replicate it down to the cracks in the marble? This is where the man who brought our world magic was laid to rest.
Leonora whispered.
Who could have possibly done that? His body was never brought here,
Porum explained.
Cluey was buried in a now derelict cemetery, along with his family, on the northern outskirts of Baron, where a tiny village once stood before being annexed by the kingdom. But somehow, his soul was drawn to this holy place. And so he stood sorrowfully in wait, until the Holy Paladin could at last ascend to his true potential. King Cecil, right?
Leonora asked, and Palom nodded.
Your dear friend that you spoke of in Troya. And now he's...
She pictured the gaunt, lifeless king in the lunar whale, and blanched.
That's right,
Palom muttered, quickly turning away. Porum saw the glimmer of a tear in the corner of his eye, staring down at her feet to spare him the indignity of him knowing she had seen him cry. Leonora lowered her head, pressing her fingers to her lips as she shuddered and closed her eyes. Porum looked up at her quizzically, biting her lip.
What's wrong? Why do I feel like something terrible is about to happen to us?
Leonora whispered under her breath.
Oh hell. What is that?
Something within the shrine had flashed in Palem's eyes, causing him to stumble backward and grind his knuckles into his face as he cursed aloud. Porum gasped, quickly tugging Leonora aside as a slender, ebony crystal materialized before them in a flash of light, purple spheres dancing in the mage's blinded eyes. Almost immediately after their vision had begun to recover, the crystal began to splinter with several ominous cracking noises, long fractures running up the face and spidering out into a network of rapidly spreading grooves.
I don't recognize that crystal.
Porum cried.
Why is it breaking? Get out of the way.
Palom gasped.
It's going to explode.
The three of them fell to their knees and covered their heads just as the crystal shattered into hundreds of dusty shards, a few lacerations slicing open across their exposed arms and backs, a small price to pay for avoiding complete oblivion. As shimmering crystal dust fell upon them from the heavens, Porum dared to drink in the putrid, black shadow that had poured out of the crystal's remains like pus in a festering wound. Despite the clear, clean mountain air, Porum suddenly felt overwhelmed by the smell of something rotting and dying, a brackish, blood-like taste flooding her mouth as she gagged on desperately needed oxygen.
It's... him.
Palom groaned into his jacket, hiking the collar up around his mouth to try to spare himself some of the debilitating stink.
You're not serious.
Porum whimpered, knowing exactly to whom her brother was referring. Such a foulness could never be replicated, nor ever forgotten by those who once experienced it. Her eyes stung as she took in the rapidly extending ivory horns that were curling from the beast's head and weaving under his armpits to form a misshapen chest plate. Patches of brown fur intermixed with crusty, black, scorched flesh took form over a riot of throbbing, vein-ridden muscles. His head was half-rotted, an exposed grinning skeleton making up the right side while rotting flesh and a single glowing orange orb for an eye made up the left. Four gnarled, yellowed claws tore at the rocky mountain floor, sending a cloud of dust into the air that intermingled with the destroyed crystal's remains.
Scarmaglione, the archfiend of Earth.
Palom hissed.
Back from the dead, are you? Although that might be a bit redundant. Now that I think about it.
Leonora let out a strangled wail, tears sliding down her cheek as she huddled into a tighter ball.
This presence. It's tied so deeply to Crystal of Earth. And just like the crystal, he's terrified.
Theodore didn't know how long he had been standing at the edge of the crystal plate, staring out at the hundreds of sparkling stars that seemed to dance in orbit around the glowing core beneath his feet. The portal in the Baronian throne room and deposited them here, another place that Rosa, Kane, and Golbez all instantly recognized, leaving Theodore in the dark. Golbez explained that they were now in the lunar core, the innermost depths of the red moon that acted as the gateway to the place the Lunarians slept. Theodore was overcome with a million questions. Suddenly, he was only a stone's throw away from the people from which a quarter of his blood had been made manifest, but it seemed that none of the adults were in the mood to answer any of his queries. Golbez had gone off on his own, advising that Rosa, Kane, and Theodore get some rest and watch Cecil while he checked things out. Having learned their lesson from the last time Golbez told them to stay put, this time everyone obeyed. Kane and Rosa found the very same portion of the crystal plate they had camped in right before their final battle with Zemus, and mostly kept to themselves with Cecil laid out between them. Before Golbez had left, he simply pointed toward the glittering stars, glaring down at Theodore as he spoke and taking the boy by surprise.
That's them. Every star in the sky is another Lunarian, dreaming of the day they can call the blue planet their home.
But before Theodore could bring himself to look at Golbez and ask any more, his uncle had disappeared. At first, Theodore tried sleeping, but when he finally managed to close his eyes, he was filled with the sudden dread of possibly hearing again that creepy, sad voice that had spoken to him in his dream on the lunar whale. His eyes snapped open, and he rolled to his side so that his back was to his mother and Kane, chewing on his lip. "Father, were you ever afraid to sleep because of your premonitions? When you were here 17 years ago with your friends and with Mother, what went through your mind? What did it feel like to have the realization that a few hours from that very moment, it was possible you could no longer exist?"
"Theodore,"
Rosa said gently, and he twitched, rolling back over so that he could face them once more. She was absent-mindedly stroking Cecil's hair as she spoke, the circles under her eyes even more pronounced and shadow-ridden now.
"It's been quite a while, maybe you should find Golbez." "Me?"
Theodore squeaked, immediately sitting upright.
"Why? You know this place better than I. You should take what he told you to heart,"
Rosa pressed, smiling slightly.
"Your ancestors are all around you at this very moment, it's more than your father and I could have ever hoped to show you. Maybe if you offer them your prayers, you'll hear something in return. As a Lunarian, you should be able to speak with them, even as they are dreaming." "What?"
Theodore blinked.
"Has father ever done anything like that?"
Rosa lowered her gaze.
"He was trying the morning you were due to come home. Trying to reach."
She trailed off, gingerly lacing a lock of Cecil's hair around her ring finger.
"Oh,"
Theodore frowned. So, even now, she hesitated to let that man's name fall from her lips when in reference to his relation with Cecil. What exactly did she expect of him, an estranged nephew, then? But when he looked up at Kane for potential backup, he merely shook his head, gesturing with his thumb behind his shoulder.
"Go on, soldier. I'm sure one of the first things you learned in the Red Wings was to acclimate yourself to your surroundings." "Yes, sir,"
Theodore replied meekly, hauling himself up and patting his scabbard to ensure his sword still remained before wandering off. And that had been how he had ended up in a trance at the ledge of the plate he had been sent to explore, trying to figure out how to do something as obscure as becoming a telepath with absolutely no clue as to what to do. It had been easy for him to sense his father, once upon a time, and even easier to realize when that precious thread between them had been severed. It had been as if someone had reached into his chest and pulled out a chunk of his heart. But to actually speak with another Lunarian, or convey to them any kind of thought? Impossible. The blue rune that had been glowing a few feet away from Theodore that he had convinced himself was a bad idea to enter alone suddenly burst to life, and Golbez appeared in a haze of dancing starlight. He immediately turned to Theodore, raising an eyebrow.
"You need something?" "And no."
Theodore gulped, and Golbez took one last long look at him before pivoting on his heel and making his approach. Theodore could feel the panic rising in his throat as his uncle's violet eyes came into view, pulsing with an entirely different power than he had ever sensed or seen in his father despite the fact that they were brothers. The word was difficult for him to manifest in his mind, let alone say aloud.
So, your birth name is Theodore, yes?
Golbez asked, and Theodore couldn't help but stare up at him dumbly.
Yes.
Golbez crossed his arms over his chest, and Theodore flinched. Had that not been an acceptable reply?
I only asked because it's a rather unusual name. I had no idea he had a son at all, much less one your age. The fact that you exist is nothing short of a miracle, in my eyes.
Theodore blanched. Did Golbez feel that way because of how many times he had tried to kill Cecil and Rosa, along with destroying an entire planet, and yet they had managed to survive and procreate? Gross, or was he trying to say something else?
It is an unusual name. I was named after my grandmother, Cecilia. And, well, you. My father's older brother.
Golbez tilted his head. Cecil? What could that possibly mean? What was going through your head when your one and only son was born? No. Do not be a sentimental fool, do not forget the last dream you had before waking form stasis. It doesn't mean anything. He couldn't have possibly forgiven me. Not for everything I had done, and the pain I continued to inflict in my absence. Edge was right. I too helped drive Cecil to this madness in my own way.
Well, I was his older brother. What?
Golbez turned his back to Theodore, gazing up at the swirl of stars above and sending a cascade of dark silver hair tumbling down his back.
I brought the world to the brink of destruction. Since then, I've hidden myself away from the universe. I don't deserve to live among my mother's people anymore. Certainly less so among my father's, but I was a coward and took the easiest way out at the time. Theodore died when he was 10 years old. Only hours after your father was born. So, the obvious conclusion is that Cecil never knew his older brother.
Theodore mimicked Golbez by crossing his own arms and taking a step forward. I'm done with riddles. I'm done with shrouded half-lies about the past. This is my legacy we're talking about too, my blood.
If that's the case, what made you come back now, then?
Theodore watched with satisfaction as Golbez's shoulders slightly hunched.
What? Why did you return to us during this time of crisis?
Theodore pressed.
Why show your face on a planet that despises you, to a family that has been dead to you for years?
When he refused to reply, Theodore took another step forward, gently grasping Golbez's forearm. He could hear the man's prayer beads clicking as he made a motion to jerk away, but ultimately didn't carry it through, letting Theodore's small, white fingers lay against his almond-colored flesh.
Did you come to help us, then? To help my father? Your brother?
Of course. Even if Fusoya hadn't forced the way, I know that in the end, I would have found him again, even if it took me the rest of my days. All my life, I've been seeking that eternal light. Longing for its grace. Longing for its peace. I'm not ready to give up that dream. Even if the end draws near, I'll dream of that light until the darkness finally absorbs what's left of me and returns me to the ruins of the planet my father loved so dearly. Golbez finally turned around, and Theodore was shocked to see the tiniest of smiles greeting him.
I guess I did.
Theodore blushed as he finally dared himself to look Golbez fully in the eye. If the man had really descended to what had to have been his ultimate hellscape just to save his father, he realized he at least owed him the respect of facing him like a man. That's what a proper Red Wing would do, after all.
Do you mind if I ask you one more thing?
Golbez blinked. That hadn't exactly been the kind of response he had been expecting, but he reminded himself that he was still talking to a 15-year-old boy.
What is it?
Theodore nodded toward the twinkling stars dancing above them.
What is it like on the moon that you call home?
Golbez couldn't help but smile more.
Are you curious?
Theodore nodded.
Well, of course. Part of my lineage is Lunarian, after all. My father has told me a lot, but he's never actually lived there, like you. When this is all over, maybe we could. You know. Visit.
My nephew. Even as we speak, the Red Moon may be no more. Despite everything you see around you here, I now know this is nothing but a fake production, a replica of what was once my home. You may truly be the last of our lineage. A burden I would never wish on anyone, but one the fates have seemingly laid upon you as the heir to the Holy Paladin.
When this is over, we can talk about it,
Golbez offered, and Theodore pressed his hands together, blushing deeper.
Thank you. Oh, you're back.
Rosa smiled, and both Golbez and Theodore spun around to face her and Cain, who was carrying Cecil.
Did you find anything?
Golbez immediately snapped back into his default pragmatic self, the smile melting away from his face.
Everything looks the same as when I last left the lunar core. I did not descend to the final chamber.
He trailed off, and Cain and Rosa seemed to know exactly what he was talking about.
We'll go together,
Cain said, and noticed Theodore's pout at being left out.
The final chamber contains the doorway to the sleeping Lunarians. And it's where we fought Zemus,
Rosa added, the lilt in her tone noticeably fading.
Well, there's nowhere else for us to go then, right?
Theodore asked.
Let's just get it over with so we can find the next door and get out of here. That's the spirit.
Cain laughed, slapping Theodore on the back.
Although that sounds more like something I would say, rather than Cecil. You're already becoming a terrible influence,
Rosa sighed, shaking her head.
Golbez, would you mind leading the way?
They stepped through the rune, which transported them to another level of the crystal plate that looked much the same as the previous, only the glowing core at the dimension center seemed to evolve as they delved deeper and deeper, gradually becoming such a blinding light that they had to shield their eyes as they made their way through the final layer. When they reached the rune that would take them the site of the battle against Zemus, Theodore blindly reached for his mother's hand, and was relieved to feel her entwine her fingers with his in response. Cecil had continued to sleep peacefully for the duration of their journey through the lunar core, the slightest of smiles set on his pale mouth. The light of the rune engulfed them, and when Theodore opened his eyes, he found himself at the base of a long, winding set of crystalline stairs, through which he could see the next level that awaited them above. He couldn't understand why his heart had started to pound so intensely the moment his feet had touched the floor. He looked back at his father one last time before beginning his ascent up the stairs behind Golbez. Cain had shifted Cecil over his shoulder, and as a result Theodore could no longer see his father's face. When they reached the top floor, Theodore stopped in his tracks, his legs feeling as if they had been suddenly encased in stone. Golbez was only a few feet away, his jaw tightly clenched and his hand already reaching for his blade. Rosa and Cain came up behind Theodore, their labored breathing immediately ceasing when their eyes fell upon the spectacle before them. A resplendent, but deformed throne made entirely out of shattered crystals was stationed just feet away in the rear of the chamber, glimmering in hues of navy and violet with the muted starlight pouring out of the depths of the lunar core sleeping beneath them. Sitting in the throne, his legs crossed and his head nonchalantly tilted against his hand, was a dark knight clad in ravenesque armor the color of a starless night, a helmet twisted with fierce black steel horns hiding the knight's face and form-fitting latex armor embracing the rest of his body like a glove, revealing every inch of clenching, toned muscle and the hilt of a scarlet-hilted blade that hung from his hip. No. Theodore gasped to himself, his eyes widening in horror. This is the man in black from my dream after the airship crash. It was never Golbez at all. The knight didn't deign to move an inch, all Theodore could see behind the visor of his helmet were two faintly glowing dots of red. Behind him, Cecil suddenly let out a terrible wail, flailing so violently against Cain that the dragoon stumbled backward and had to put Cecil down before they were both thrown over the ledge of the stairs. Cecil screamed as he fell from Cain's arms and collapsed to his knees, grasping his head and releasing another howl into the vastness of the empty space above them.
Cecil!
Rosa cried, kneeling to his side and trying to pull his hands away from his head.
Oh gods, what's happening to him? Who are you?
Theodore gulped, and Golbez immediately slid in front of Theodore as the knight started to rise, his boots ringing against the crystal tile as he reached to his hip for his sword.
You!
Golbez gasped, and Cain rushed in front of Cecil and Rosa, calling upon his lance and immediately turning it upon the approaching intruder.
No!
Cain cried.
It can't be! This is impossible!
Rosa lifted her head from trying to tend to Cecil's fit, her eyes flitting to the knight as the blood drained from her face. At that moment, Cecil screamed bloody murder once more, the piercing sound waves bouncing off the hallowed halls of the chamber and shattering the crystal throne into thousands of pieces.
Gaah.
Theodore barely had time to register what happened when Golbez swept the boy under his cape, turning his back to shield Theodore from the aftermath of the crystal explosion. Cain cast a protect spell over himself, Rosa and Cecil, the crystal debris bouncing off the golden light harmlessly as it flew toward and over them. Theodore could hear Golbez growling in his throat and peeked out from beneath the cloak only to see the knight nearly at their side, jagged crystals embedded in his armor and drips of blood staining the floor in his wake.
Cecil.
Rosa whimpered, and Theodore turned to stare at his mother, only to realize she was addressing her question toward the Dark Knight.
I knew it,
Golbez muttered, finally withdrawing his sword.
Theodore, on your guard. Wait.
Theodore shrieked as Golbez darted forward and slashed his blade into the Dark Knight's, sending the knight skidding back a few feet from the unexpected force of his blow. He turned to Cain and Rosa, who were observing the beginnings of the carnage with muted horror.
Mother, why did you call him Cecil? Because this is my true self.
The Dark Knight suddenly hissed in a too familiar drawl, throwing Golbez off of him and laughing manically as he held his blade aloft, the sword starting to glow with a putrid black aura. He flipped open the visor on his helmet, and Theodore felt his heart drop to his stomach. The face in the visor, with the exception of a pair of pulsating, blood-red eyes, was that of his father's, right down to the slope of his nose and the curl of silver hair that always hung over his face, no matter what he tried to do with it or how long he grew it out.
No. No.
Theodore cried, tears clouding his vision as he grasped blindly for his sword.
You're a liar.
But even so, he couldn't bring himself to actually withdraw his weapon. There was no way he could ever hold a blade to his father's throat again, not after what had happened back in the throne room at Baron when Cecil had collapsed after Theodore released the spell that had banished Odin's nightmare.
I have no use for these bodies. These shells. I am the true Cecil.
The Dark Knight twisted his sword horizontally, an overpowering wave of darkness springing forth from the blade and shooting toward them in the shape of rapidly multiplying shanks. Theodore shrieked and lifted his buckler, even though he already knew such a weak instrument would do nothing against a spell as terrifying as this. Golbez was struggling to unwrap himself from the column the Dark Knight had effortlessly tossed him into, reaching his hand out toward the others with a silent cry as the darkness overtook them.
Grh. Waik.
Cecil grunted, and without warning, leapt to his feet and pushed past Theodore and Cain, throwing himself in the way of the darkness just as it was poised to strike. His body shuddered and seized relentlessly as it was assaulted, his eyes rolling in the back of his head when the final blade struck his abdomen and sent him flying flat on his back.
Father!
Theodore screamed, and the Dark Knight shook his head, laughing as he sheathed his sword and extended his left hand, a globe of swirling black mist lacing itself between his fingers.
Was that the final flame? Enough, you shall.
The black mist shot forward like a harpoon, ensnaring Cecil's limbs and dragging his still body back toward the Dark Knight. With a twist of his fingers, the knight manipulated Cecil's body like a marionette, forcing the broken man to his knees and proceeding to push his palm upward so that Cecil's head would lift forward, forcing him to face the Dark Knight even with his eyes closed.
This mockery ends now.
The Dark Knight hissed, withdrawing a knife from his belt and giving it a toss in the air before catching it and diving forward. There came a flash of light, the shattered crystals from the makeshift throne that had scattered all over the chamber suddenly exploding in a dazzling bout of radiance. Theodore saw the flicker of a dancing shadow and realized far too late that Golbez had launched himself away from the pillar and had thrown himself directly between Cecil and the Dark Knight. There was a sickening squelch, and the despondent tingle of crunching glass. When the light from the crystals died into a quiet glow, Golbez was paused in front of a still paralyzed Cecil, his head lowered and his entire body quaking. Plunged into his chest was the Dark Knight's knife, the slightest trickle of crimson seeping into Golbez's cloak and blooming into a crooked stain. The Dark Knight chortled, shaking his head.
You dare to believe this atones for anything? For terrorizing the entire world.
Golbez could taste the blood pooling in the corner of his mouth as he choked on his contrition.
I am sorry.
Cecil's eyes had snapped open, the paladin staring wordlessly as Golbez stumbled backward, twisting grotesquely so that he could catch just one more glance of Cecil's crystalline blue gaze as he fell to the ground, another round of crystal shards doomed to dust beneath the crush of his stiffening body. Ah! There it is. At long last. That beautiful, holy light. I always knew I would find it in your eyes, brother.
Forgive me. Cecil.
Golbez's eyes slid shut, the chorus of screams from Cain, Rosa, and Theodore that had erupted around him fading into a most divine oblivion. End of chapter.